Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Online Peace Science Colloquium. We're meeting today, May 3rd, 2019, and today we're going to be hearing a presentation from Erica de Bruin, who is an assistant professor of political science at Hamilton College. And we're joined by a panel of excellent discussants to discuss her paper today. We're joined by Jonathan Powell, who's an associate professor of political science at the University of Central Florida, June Koga Sudduth, who is a lecturer at the University of Strathclyde in Glasgow. And we have Peter White, who is an assistant professor of political science at Auburn University. So I'm Emily Hencken Ritter. I'm the chair and the director of the Online Peace Science Colloquium, and we are an organization that's connected, or an institution connected with the Peace Science Society International, where we share research that's ongoing and try to give feedback for ongoing projects so they can be the best they can be. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Erica, who will share her slides and give us a presentation on her topic, her paper.
All right, can you see the slides?
Yep. Yes. Can you make them full screen?
Good question. How's that?
Looks, wait, I have nothing.
Oh no.
Do you see it? Blank. Okay, there we go. I mean, you could just go from there and that'll be great.
Perfect. All right. Thank you so much. Thanks so much for the opportunity to present today. I'm presenting a new project that I've been working on that explores the links between some different forms of political violence, and in particular, the links between civil wars and coups d'etat. The title of the paper I'm presenting today is From Civil War to Coup d'etat, How Peace Agreements Shape Post-Conflict Violence. And I'll just give you the sort of basic intuition up front. I was sort of thinking about the connections between these two different forms of political violence. And one thing that struck me is that many peace agreements that we see today that end civil wars have provisions to reform the existing state's military, and in particular to bring former rebels into the state in various capacities, whether that's into the military itself or into other parts of the government. But often rebels or the populations that they represent were excluded on purpose as a coup prevention strategy, right? They're sort of kept out of the centers of political power to reduce the risk of coups. And so the basic idea here was that bringing them back in at the end of a civil war might increase that risk again. So that's a sort of basic intuition for the project. And we know a lot at this point, I think, about peace agreements and power sharing at the end of civil wars. There's a sort of large literature about how power sharing is thought to mitigate commitment problems in the aftermath of civil war, give rebels a sort of stake in the new political system, and as a result, reduce the likelihood of conflict resuming, though there's the evidence on its effectiveness is somewhat mixed. And around the time I was sort of thinking about how these things worked, I was fortunate to have a conversation with one of our discussants today, Peter White, who it turns out had also been thinking a little bit about this, or a lot about this connection between peace agreements or the ends of civil wars and coup attempts. And he has a great paper that I hope I can say is now forthcoming. Peter, you should stop me if I can't. Okay, so it's now forthcoming in the Journal of Politics that brings some quantitative data to bear on this. And it demonstrates that countries that have recently signed peace agreements are more likely to see coup attempts. And Peter finds that this is particularly true where agreements include provisions for military power sharing. And there's a bunch of examples of this, Guinea-Bissau in 1999, Mali in 1991, Cambodia in 1997, etc. So we have this sort of quantitative association that coups are more likely where peace agreements have been recently signed. So the research question that I'm trying to tackle in this paper is what explains this connection, that the prevalence of coup attempts in these settings. And here I should just pause to say that I'm thinking about coups as sort of the definition that Jonathan uses, which is that coup attempts are illegal overt attempts by the military or other elites within the state to oust the executive. So they have to come from within, somewhere within the state apparatus. And the basic argument that I set out in this paper is that in post-conflict settings, power-sharing measures which are intended to prevent war from resuming can inadvertently increase the risk of coups d'etat. And there are two potential mechanisms here that I fleshed out. One is the one that Peter develops in his forthcoming paper, and that's about how these peace agreements end up generating new grievances within the military. The second mechanism I flesh out is more about what happens with former rebels. And I develop an argument about how bringing former rebels into the state gives them access, the access they need to centers of political power that are the targets of coups, and provides them with state resources that they can turn around and use to try and oust the executive. And I'm in the presentation today, I'll sort of go through each of these in a bit more detail and illustrate them with 2 cases. But I want to emphasize at the beginning here that these are not necessarily competing mechanisms. I think likely both are happening in different contexts. But I think it is important to try and distinguish between them because they suggest coups by different types of actors and at different time periods surrounding peace agreements. And so understanding the different ways in which peace agreements might be associated with coups, I think is important for trying to prevent them. Okay, so the current status of the project is that I'm in this paper trying to flesh out the potential causal mechanisms and their observable implications and probing their plausibility in some cases, which are not really intended to test them, but just kind of illustrate how this is happening. And then I'm starting to collect some large N data to test the mechanisms more directly against each other in a subsequent paper. Okay, so the first mechanism here is the one that Peter develops in his paper. So this is a little preview, or a little, I guess, a little advertisement for his work. But the basic idea here is that when civil wars end, the government can't credibly commit to maintaining high military spending. This is something that, military budgets often get very highly inflated in the context of civil war. And there's many peace agreements have provisions that require cutbacks in military spending or cuts down in the size of the military. Rebel military integration exacerbates this problem because the smaller resources that do exist then must be shared with former rebels. Where rebels are integrated into the military at higher ranks, this can curtail promotions, which might generate resentment among junior officers. And there may also be psychological challenges of working and fighting alongside former enemies. So this sort of mechanism predicts coup attempts by existing soldiers or soldiers that were in the military at the outset of the conflict prior to or during the implementation of peace agreements, because the idea here is that they're trying to stop this integration from going forward. And this mechanism, I think, tracks with, there's a sort of traditional distinction in the literature on civil-military relations about what drives military coups, both depending on soldiers having the disposition or the motive to intervene, that there's some grievances there, but then also the opportunity. And this mechanism focuses on that sort of first disposition or grievance aspect of it. And I think the case of coups in Burundi in 2001 is a good case to sort of illustrate this mechanism. This is a case in which the Civil War itself was also largely about what was happening, who was integrated into the state apparatus, and who was making up the military itself. So a central issue in this Civil War for Hutu rebels was inequality in the military, which was dominated by Tutsi officers and soldiers. There were peace accords in the year 2000, which provided for power sharing across a bunch of different state institutions within the executive and the legislature, and also within the military. There was supposed to be, at the end of this, a sort of 50-50 split, but it was actually there was a little bit of disagreement about whether or not it was a 50-50 Hutu-Tutsi split or 50-50 rebels and non-rebels. But the idea was the rebels were going to be integrated in large numbers. The military initially let integration go forward, bringing Hutu into the rank and file. But when there were efforts to bring them in at higher levels into the officer corps, there were 2 failed coup attempts to try and prevent that integration. Okay, the second mechanism, second way in which I think the peace agreements could be linked to post-conflict coups is by, rather than generating grievances among existing soldiers, enabling rebels, the people that have been brought into the state themselves, to stage these coups. And this, I think, tracks well with the sort of other aspect of what we think of being necessary for coups, which is the opportunity and having the access to do it. So this suggests that coup attempts will be happening by former rebels. And in developing this argument, I'm drawing on a wealth of work here by Philip Rossler, Kristen Harkness, and many others about exclusion, and particularly ethnic exclusion in the armed forces, where the basic idea is that if you're a ruler concerned about staying in power, you want to limit the number of people that have the capacity to oust you from office very easily. Through a coup, and that often happens along ethnic lines. But when you exclude them, exclude people that have had access, have military expertise, that have had access to state resources, they can then go on to form an armed challenge against you in a sort of in the form of a rebel group. So the basic idea here is that if those people are brought back into the state through power sharing, it diversifies the armed forces and other government institutions. And that gives those people, again, and provides those people previously excluded with access and resources needed to stage coups. So this mechanism then would predict coups by former rebels, and we would not be likely to see it operate until after power sharing has actually been implemented, right? So it's a sort of a different time frame. And I think one case that illustrates this mechanism is a coup in 1999 in Guinea-Bissau. There was civil war in Guinea-Bissau. It was very short-lived. It actually also started with a coup. It began in June of 1998, and it was precipitated by a sort of personal falling out between the president and the Army Chief of Staff. Much of the military ended up defecting and then trying to seize power through an armed insurrection rather than through a coup. There was a peace agreement in November of that year that included provisions for executive and legislative power sharing, but crucially not military power sharing, interestingly enough. And it started to go forward, but part of the agreement involved the president having to disband the presidential guard. He dragged his feet on this, ended up building up co-ethnic militias, and rebel troops in the capital sort of grew frustrated with this feet dragging. And even though that they had been disarmed, so they were present in the capital, but they were not part of the official military, they had to give up their weapons. But they knew where they were and were able to seize them from storage and use them to successfully oust the president. Right. So this is a case in which executive and legislative power sharing, and primarily executive here, was important in giving sort of access and information. And then it allowed rebels to actually go ahead and take weapons back. Okay. So I'm going to end this presentation with a lot of questions for my discussants. I'm very grateful to have give feedback at this kind of early stage in this project. I'm still working out, I think, both aspects of the theory and how exactly I'm going to test it. And so I wanted to first just ask if there are other causal mechanisms that any of you have thought of that might connect peace agreements to coups. Or is there anything that I am missing here, or that seemed like an obvious alternate explanation that isn't explored? And in particular, is there some other, or in addition, is there another factor that you think might explain both the adoption of power sharing and the incidence of coup attempts? So is there something that's driving sort of both of these things? One thing that I've thought a little bit about here is combatant strength, or like how strong the rebel group is. Might also have something to do with rebel origin. So if, as in Guinea-Bissau, the rebel group itself had been part of the military initially, that might give them more of an impetus basically they might have a bit higher capacity to stage the coups. External intervention might matter. Anything else that you can think of, I would really appreciate hearing your feedback on. I'm also, I think, still trying to work out whether it's power sharing more generally or just rebel military integration that matters, or whether or not it's the deployment of troops. If the rebels, for instance, have capital access, even if they're not, or they're allowed in the capital, even if they're not necessarily integrated into state institutions, could that be what's driving this? I'm also wondering about if there's different forms of power sharing that are more likely to generate grievances, such as vertical power sharing sort of throughout the ranks. And then finally, one thing I'm still thinking about is how relevant these arguments might be outside the context of African civil wars or outside the context of ethnically divided states. So any insight that you can give on these questions or any other questions or feedback you have, I'm really looking forward to it. Thank you.
Thanks, Erica. And with that, I'll turn it over to our discussants and whoever would like to go first. June, hang on, let me unmute you. Can you unmute yourself? June, you're muted. Sorry, everyone, just a moment. Okay, there we go.
Hi.
Hi, June.
Oh, so sorry again. I'm so sorry.
That's
I'm
okay.
just through this. Okay. Sorry, I've been just talking by myself. I didn't notice.
No, that's okay.
Okay. So
Go right
I
ahead.
was just saying I enjoyed listening. I enjoyed this paper. Obviously, I guess I'm gonna ask a specific question about the second mechanism, right? So I guess the first mechanism about the military integration of peace agreement will kind of increase the grievance of the existing or incumbent military officers, and they try to basically prevent the peace agreement being actually happening, right? So that makes sense, and then the case study part is also, to me, makes sense. One thing which I just kind of wasn't really too much convincing to me was the mechanism too, even though that was a kind of the new aspect of your paper, and it's very interesting, it's plausible. But so I just got, basically my question is like the case of the Guinea-Bissau might be a kind of extreme cases, so that I'm not sure we can use it as a kind of a base case to kind of give support. Even though I understand you're using it as rather than testing it, you are using it to kind of show the mechanism itself. But from my understanding, this Guinea-Bissau case is a really extremely weird case in the sense that, as you said, it's a civil war, but it's pretty much the coup turns into big civil war. So what I mean is that the former rebel or rebel is basically the previous government member, right? So the rebel leaders are basically Vieira, who is the president of the incumbent president, his main ally within the regime, top hierarchy. And then basically he was purged, so preventively he started a war against Vieira, and that made into a big civil war. But the rebel, as you mentioned in the presentation in the paper, the majority of rebel, let's say, soldiers are actually former military, like actual rebel military, right? It's not actually opposition. Typically, we think about rebel groups, right? And so it seems like basically it is actually, to me, like it's not really rebel group, opposition group, which we usually think about who don't have access to the state resources. It's they are actually former member of the government and military, so therefore they obviously have high capability to succeed a coup anyway. So I thought, so now they are turned into the government after the peace agreement, but they are again, they are former rebel, but they are former previous government member. So it seems to me like it's kind of relatively obvious that they have high capability of making a coup, but I'm not sure this argument actually applies to other actual former rebel, especially if not so many people can be, go inside the military after the civil war, right? But this case is like really high percentage of former rebels / former regime military are actually come back to as a military soldier or officers. Does that make sense? I'm not sure, like, yeah, so that's kind of, I have several other points, but that's, I'll stop here.
Jonathan had an add-on to that.
Yeah, just echoing what June was just bringing up, I had really two issues with the Guinea-Bissau case. First, like June was saying, Ansoumani Mane and the rebellion itself isn't going to be very typical or very generalizable, right? I mean, when the rebellion itself started, it was actually a coup attempt, but Mane ended up with easily a majority of the armed forces behind him the whole time, and they were easily more powerful than what the government was. It just took, international intervention to keep the government in place. So one, I would just think a little bit about how much is the Guinea-Bissau case going to tell us about, power sharing after civil wars more generally. But a different issue that I have with the Guinea-Bissau case is, might this just be another example of power sharing or a post-Civil War agreement or peace agreement just breaking down, but the nature of the case makes it look like a coup instead of a civil war? So just to elaborate on that a little bit, we have the agreement in place, we have a peace, we have the former rebels start to be reincorporated into the armed forces, and then the president starts to backtrack on promises to demobilize his presidential guard. That could effectively just mean he's reneged on the peace agreement. The peace agreement is failing. And in other civil wars, we might see the resumption of fighting. But since we've seen these folks reintegrated, this is now going to be considered a coup attempt. So I guess my point would be, does the distinction between a return to fighting in terms of recurrence of civil war versus an attempted coup, might it just be kind of semantics at this point? And or if not, how do we distinguish the difference between just a recurrence to fighting versus a specific idea like a military coup more generally?
Erica.
Great, thank you. All right, these are great comments to start out. Thank you to you. Thanks to you both. Yeah, I think that I would agree that I think that in some respects this is a very extreme case, and it doesn't look like a lot of the other civil wars. There are some other cases, obviously, in which there's higher levels of defection from the regular military, but this really is a case in which they basically may have had this capacity in the first place, right? It wasn't being reintegrated into the state that gave them the capacity to stage the coups, because they had been part of it sort of at the outset of the conflict, which was very close in time. So yes, I'm thinking about this case, I think, primarily as trying to help me refine what I'm then going to do with a quantitative analysis, and maybe not like if this were to be a standalone paper trying to illustrate mechanisms. I think that this would not be, I think for the reasons that you guys have pointed out, not be the ideal sort of illustration of that, just because it is such an outlier. But in some ways, I think that it being so weird has raised a lot of, or sort of pushed me to think about things in a sort of try to get much more at what it is that really matters. So is it capital access that matters? Is it the origins of the rebel group? That's what's actually driving this. And is it actually even rebel military integration, or is it like in this case, can you just have integration into other sort of state institutions? And so I think in some ways this opened up a bunch of new questions for me that I then will try and look at in additional cases. But I don't think it's a good case for sort of proving the importance of this particular mechanism. On the second question that Jonathan raised about, is this just a case of the peace agreement breaking down? I think that this raises a sort of broader issue that is, but one that I've been grappling with for a while, about how we actually distinguish coup attempts from civil wars, particularly very violent coup attempts, right? And in this case, it's coded as a coup, right? Because it's technically coming from within the state, but the integration is so recent that I think it doesn't. It's not clear that there is a real sort of distinction here, and so I think that it might be worth going through the sort of cases of coup attempts following civil wars and actually trying to identify both the identity of who is staging the coup attempts, but also whether or not what they end up leading to, or what they are, whether or not they're part of a sort of re-escalation of the Civil War or not, and maybe bracketing those off as a sort of separate sort of phenomenon from what we think of as normal coups from within the military. So these are all different ways, I think, to slice the different things I should be collecting data on, and trying to different ways of kind of trying to divide up examples of what's happening in the data. And I feel like this is that you're both correct that this is an outlier, but I don't have a good sense of what the distribution is of coup attempts, for example, that are kind of happening within this context of just restarting the Civil War or not. So that would be, I think, a good thing for me to look at next.
Peter. Hang on, Peter, you're muted.
Sorry about that. So I had just one quick add-on, and then my main comment. The quick add-on I thought of is something that I struggled with in my paper, again, with this sort of coup Civil War nexus, and in the way in which the coup stems from the Civil War in some way, bridges to episodes of the Civil Wars or feature of the Civil War. In some ways, sort of where I land on that is that the fact that the coup may restart the Civil War or continue the fighting in the Civil War is in some ways, you could think of it as a bug, but also a feature, because in terms of framing and motivation, and that these coups, regardless of whether they come from the old guard military or the former rebels, have the potential to restart a civil war, and kind of be the bridge between two episodes of Civil War that ends a fragile peace. So I just think, just as an aside in terms of framing, I think that's part of like an answer to like the why do we care about these coups that stem from civil wars. My other point that's sort of separate from this discussion is that as I was, and you may be thinking about this as you move into sort of data collection, but one sort of thing that I think you could connect this with is sort of Singh's argument on coups from the top and coups from the middle and coups from the bottom. Because it seems to me that if your intuition is correct, and I think it is, in sort of identifying these two mechanisms and these two pathways through which military peace agreements and particularly integration provisions can lead to post-conflict coups or coups that even restart the Civil War. It seems to me that the grievances-based argument that comes sort of from the argument about the old guard military, the incumbent military, seems like, and the Burundi case supports this, it seems to be a coup from the bottom, maybe from the middle, and that's part of the reason that it might not succeed. Whereas if your argument about, with regards to it being former rebels, is true, and that it's also a sort of corollary to that is it's not just about the military, it's about access to the capital and integration and political leadership. And it seems to me that those coups should be coups from the top. And in lines with Singh's argument, those would be more likely to succeed and in some ways would be more dangerous, because their chances of success and potentially restarting the conflict. But yeah, that's it.
Was there two things, or can I?
There we go. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Great. Thanks so much for these comments, Peter. Yeah, I think that you definitely might be onto something here about these two mechanisms predicting coups from different ranks. And in particular, I can think about the grievance mechanism that you've developed, thinking about that particularly happening where there's integration at the higher ranks, right? Like that seems to really be the thing that is triggering coups from below. And you can think about often there may be attempts in these peace agreements or from the regime that comes to power at the end of a civil war to try and not buy off necessarily the high ranking officers, but like they need to, like, they're aware that this might be an issue. And so it might be easier to placate sort of individual high-ranking officers than the rest of the sort of rank and file of the military, many of whom may be dismissed, many are fear that they might have to end up losing their jobs, or may have to take orders from sort of newly integrated forces. And so it might just be harder to try and compensate in some way for this integration for people at the lower ranks. And so I'd be really interested in testing or taking a look empirically then at like whether or not the coups that we see, basically if you have integration go forward, do you see more coups from the top that end up being more successful? And if you have if these coups that are happening sort of during implementation or prior end up being from the middle. That's something I think that there's enough data on that I could take a look at, and it's a great idea. So thank you.
We have June up next.
Right. Can you hear?
Yeah.
Okay, good. So it's kind of related to what Peter was just mentioning, but like it's because the one interesting part of this paper is basically clarifies there are two different mechanisms. So it would be nice to highlight a bit more on what's the kind of different type of coup that each different mechanism is expecting. So one is obviously that Peter said, type of plotters, like whether it's high ranking or if we have that and stuff. But I also think the one which you was emphasizing in the paper is the timing, right? And I think this part was not necessarily well highlighted in the case. And I thought that is like, especially when you go to, I'm not sure that you do any quantitative studies, but it's relatively easy to kind of objectively capture the difference. But also I felt like, what do you mean by, you know, after the implementation or during the implementation? Because I'm going to send you the paper after this, but I've been working with similar type of things, and then it's just difficult to kind of civil war is like there is no the end, and then so like peace agreement you signed and you're implementing, but the peace conflict again reoccurred and stuff like that. So it's very difficult to say like, is this after the implementation, or you know, or this was like this time lag? And especially when I was reading this Guinea-Bissau's case, which Jonathan was mentioning at the beginning, but this seems like relatively very quickly just breaking down with a peace agreement, rather than, you know, it's all the integration was completed and rebel got more power and stuff like that. So anyway, so that's so I guess my point was like, I think it's really interesting insight, which I really encourage you to focus more on this timing stuff. But it seems very difficult. It's very challenging task to actually specifically characterize what you mean by like operationalize the timing, both in terms of qualitative and quantitative studies. And another part which I thought was, if I'm not misunderstanding, the mechanism to focus on the the successful coup or the capability of coup, right? And then the mechanism one is more about the grievance. So if it's really about the power sharing agreement, actually empower the former rebel by giving them resources to the state institution, and then therefore they're more likely to have successful coup, then I guess we would expect that successful coup are more likely to happen from the former rebel group. But if the grievance argument is true, doesn't necessarily, I mean, grievance does not necessarily lead to high successful coup. So it could be like, does that make sense? If the mechanism two based on is building on the assumption that power sharing will increase the successful coup, maybe the outcome of successful coup, whether coup attempt failed or successful coup, that might be a good kind of predicted outcome to differentiate whether mechanism two is working or mechanism one is working. Yeah. So,
Erica.
Sorry. Great. Oh, this is really helpful. Thank you, June. Yeah. Okay. So I can definitely take the suggestion to, I think drilling down into kind of like what do these coups actually look like would be really, really helpful, and what are the different types of coups that that can result. I have also, as I've started collecting data, I'm even just trying to categorize, you know, sort of when implementation is happening, what type of implementation I'm talking about, when do I consider it sufficient that it might start triggering this second mechanism, and then is there a coup, like when my cutoff is for what a coup attempt would be, sort of after that is causing all sorts of difficulties already. And so yeah, I'll be interested to see the work that you send me, and I think it's really like, I think in some respects, right, if like integration goes forward, drilling into the military, I'm not sure what the endpoint should be, right, in terms of when I, like a coup 5 years down the road, a coup 10 years down the road, like if it's being staged by former rebels, it might end up being still sort of be a like sort of long running effect. And so that does really complicate trying to come up with a way to test this in a pretty straightforward way. And I think it means that I have to be very careful about how the decisions that I'm making about what to include and what to not include in the analysis, and try and sort of provide some rationale, but also, you know, show people that ideally this would hold the sort of varying temporal thresholds, at least at the in terms of after the coup. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges in collecting that data, but I think it is a nice sort of feature of thinking through this sort of grievance versus opportunity mechanisms as having these different sort of implications that give you a sense of, you know, when the coup might happen, who's the coup might be staging, and as you guys have been pointing out, also potentially when whether it's going to succeed or not, right? So maybe I could bring all three of those sort of predictions and triangulate in some way to think about distinguishing between them. But I also I want to emphasize that I don't think it's necessarily, I'm not trying to test whether one mechanism is more right or something than the other mechanism, but just to suggest that they are likely both happening in some circumstances, and we can respond to knowing basically who's going to stage a coup and at what point, or who might be more likely to, can allow you to sort of target both provisions within a peace agreement, but also external support in various ways that might help you mitigate that risk. But so that trying to understand who the actors are and what their interests are is important. So yeah.
Jonathan.
Yeah, so one quick thing before I get to the point that I wanted to make. Erica, you mentioned something about, like looking at a more long-term effect. I think it's interesting with Burundi because I think you could make the case that the recent coup attempt against Nkurunziza, like you could interpret that as kind of a long-term failure of at least some aspects of the peace agreement, with him trying to manipulate the constitution. But I was going to go back to this idea of opportunity versus motive. And again, looking at this Guinea-Bissau case. So, like the former rebels, sure, they can gain access to the capital after being incorporated in the armed forces. The other issue is motive. So you could ask, okay, did they rebel because they had the capital access, or was it because of motive, because they thought the leader was backing off of the peace agreement? I think it would be really interesting to try to think about a case, if you can identify any, where especially if you're working on arguments that have to do with credible commitments. So like if Vieira had in fact actually demobilized the units that he was supposed to demobilize, that would have increased the probability or the opportunity for a coup even more dramatically for Mané and his supporters, but they wouldn't have had the motivation, right? So I think it would be interesting if you could identify basically negative cases like peace agreements, coups didn't occur. But if you do see where leaders did do things to really credibly commit to giving the other side power, including things like demobilizing units that are going to be the most loyal to them as a sign of the commitment to the peace, I think that could be potentially much more interesting than looking just at cases in which coups did occur. Another minor point, so we've been focusing on that second process with where the incorporated rebels have rebelled against the government, but going back to the first mechanism where soldiers already in the government might effectively attempt a coup to veto the integration of former rebels. One of the things that I'd like to see is more consideration of soldiers or officers being worried about demobilization of themselves. So not necessarily the offensiveness of their former enemies suddenly being included in the armed forces, but also the prospects of me losing my job as a part of that. Because I think that's a potentially a really important part of it that isn't really being discussed at all at this point. And they're, two sides of the same coin, but especially in post-conflict settings where you're going to see usually massive demobilization anyway. You're going to have a lot of folks that were fighting for the government that know that they're going to be out of a job. So I'd be kind of curious if those sorts of concerns play a role as well.
Erica.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you. Yeah, I think as I've been looking through, or both of those, sorry, both points were very helpful. Starting with the last one on the first mechanism. Yeah, I think we've been going through sort of peace agreement provisions, right? You see that rebel military integration is only like one of a large number of military reforms that can be included, right? So some peace agreements specifically say there's going to be a percentage of the force or a certain number of people demobilized. Some say the military budget will be cut by a certain amount. Some say units will be sectioned off. Like, for example, internal security force will no longer be under military control. It will go under the Ministry of Interior. And all of those things seem to me like they might provoke grievances. And so I think that the nice thing is that there's that data already somebody else has compiled, and it could be used to try and disaggregate then if we're thinking specifically about the grievance mechanism, which of these things are more likely to generate grievances within the military than others. And I think that one thing that is important for me here is in thinking about different cases and trying to test these things quantitatively, I want to make sure that I am coding the identity of the coup plotters, right? Like making sure that I'm not capturing coups that are happening for some other reason. And so it'd be good to, I think, identify then
coups that are being staged by people that were a part of the armed forces at the outside of the conflict, or when the conflict was ending, but before integration, and testing whether then those types of coups, or those specific set of coups, are associated with these different types of reform. Because you can imagine them sort of piling on one another, right? That like this is situations in which both people are being integrated and the budget is being cut, or both people are being integrated and the rebels are being integrated and other people are being demobilized, and being much more likely to trigger some sort of intervention to stop it. So I'd love to sort of to think a little bit more about those other types of things that might provoke grievances, and I appreciate you emphasizing that point. In terms of the first comment about looking at sort of negative cases, I think that's a great suggestion and a good place for me to go next, because I've sort of sold this, or been thinking about this largely in terms of capacity of the rebels. But I kind of assume that they have like grievances, right? That like grievances are existing for long-standing grievances because they have been rebelling against the state. But the process of integration or the implementation of peace agreements can be generating new grievances, right? If they're being promised things and then it being sort of walked back. And so I think that's a great place to look, is at case studies where people are following, or the existing regime is following through. So that's a thing I will plan to do next. Thank you.
Peter.
All right, remember to unmute my microphone. Just to build off Jonathan's point, I mean, I think that the data you're collecting is ultimately going to be quite rich and be able to address this question very directly. But in terms of sort of my first cut, in looking at the peace agreements and the provisions contained in them, not necessarily though implementation, I controlled for DDR provisions alongside the integration provisions, and found throughout that DDR demobilization provisions, independent of integration provisions, did not have an effect either way on the likelihood of a post-conflict coup. And I think what might sort of help get at this, is it the integration, or is it the sort of demobilization that co-occurs with the integration, or the execution of the integration, might relate to another question, Erica, that you raised at the close of your presentation, was how much of this is just tied in with ethnic conflict and ethnic politics? Because even if, you're a demobilized soldier from the old guard army and you're getting some sort of side payment or something that makes you personally, economically more amenable to being demobilized, if you feel that, you see the military as fundamentally an ethnic institution as part of the ethnic balance of power, and you're thinking in terms of an ethnic security dilemma and the ethnic conflict independent of military politics, then the integration provision is going to threaten you regardless of whatever side payment you get. So I think that's something, I think, Erica, you're well positioned to address.
Erica.
Great. No, I appreciate it. I had forgotten that you included that, Peter, so thank you for reminding me. I mean, it's interesting, right, that we don't see a relationship there, because I would certainly anticipate that demobilization would be equally likely to provoke coups. And I'm wondering if it has something to do with like when demobilization is this is likely to happen, right? And so I'm thinking about sort of what the terms of the peace agreement are, and what the sort of balance of power is between the different sides at the end of the conflict. So a military that feels that it has been defeated or performed poorly, right, is maybe more likely to accept demobilization or accept the integration of new units because they don't feel they have the standing to intervene, or that they don't they are sort of, this might seem like a more sort of natural consequence, whereas where situations in which it's more of a draw, there might be a little bit more sort of resentment about that, or situations in which the military feels like it ended on a high note. So I might need to think about that as well. And so I think this is also something I raised in the last slide, of just about like, what is it that's driving the adoption of particular peace agreement provisions, whether that's rebel military integration, or that's demobilization, or cutting the size of the military. Like, when are we more likely to see those things happening? And then is it that sort of on the ground situation that is driving sort of both of these end results? Thanks for this comment.
June.
Yeah, this is really a kind of small point, but and maybe it was touched by someone before, but for the mechanism too, like we talked about a lot about the ability part, how the capability of former rebel are being increased by the power sharing, but the what exactly is the grievance? What exactly is the motivation of former rebel to attempt a coup? Because I understand that obviously, if the ability increase, that generally probability of coup should increase. You know, holding other stuff constant, but yeah. So this Guiana versus case is, again, it's very specific case, right? So, but in your general theoretical idea, is this why former rebel are willing to take certain risk to attempt a coup? Is this because it is related to power sharing, or this is not really, whatever, it's not really about your theory? So I'm just kind of, but it's kind of a relatively important point, because the mechanism one focuses very specifically about grievance, talk about a lot about the preference of military and plotter, but the mechanism too is only about the probability of success and ability. Yeah.
Great, thanks, June. Yeah, I think that that is something I need to think a little bit more about. It's obvious. I think that the most likely set of grievances here, I think, do relate to probably implementation of the peace agreement, or the extent to which rebels feel like they're actually being brought into the state in a real way, and that this is not that it's probably like connected to the rest of the government sort of following through on additional provisions, and so it's probably the case that if you integrated the military, like basically if implementation just like went forward of everything that was agreed to, right? Like I maybe necessarily wouldn't expect, maybe you wouldn't expect coups from former rebels in the same way, right? If they like get what they wanted out of the peace agreement. But I think that there's probably, it's probably pretty rare that a rebel group feels like they've gotten everything that they could out of the situation. And so they then have the, like being integrated into the state apparatus, right, gives them the capacity to sort of continue to press. And I think it might be a sort of open question of whether or not they then just like, they feel like they have this leverage and they can use it to extract even more concessions, or whether or not if a sort of implementation just goes forward as was agreed to for whatever the existing agreement is, whether or not that's sort of enough. And so, yeah, that's a good thing, a sort of question to think about. And I feel like I don't have a good sense yet of whether or not there's like other motivations. I could see sort of down the road, right? Then if they are sort of successfully integrated into the military, if the military budget as a whole gets cut, they can start to think of themselves as part of the sort of military as an institution, and that the other things we think of as prompting coups, infringing upon the autonomy of the military, or cutting its budget, or things like that, if that would then, they would end up staging coups for those reasons as well. I would be interested to sort of see how that plays out. So I think that suggests just trying to look a little bit more closely at the coup attempts that are occurring in these situations, and seeing what the sort of stated motivations are, and sort of seeing whether or not they're happening, like what's going on with the rest of the peace agreement. And that would be important sort of context under sort of fleshing this mechanism out a little bit more. So thanks for that suggestion.
Jonathan.
So if you're looking at peace agreements, the integration of rebel soldiers into the national militaries, and then implications for civil-military relations, you know, a recent case that I think is going to be difficult to not address in some way is going to be Côte d'Ivoire. You know, like we didn't see a coup attempt there, obviously, but we've seen very pronounced strains between the government and rebels that have been incorporated into the armed forces. So one of the things that I think could potentially be useful is maybe look beyond coups and look at things like more general army mutinies where they didn't attempt to overthrow the government, because there have been a lot of those cases. You know, like Burundi, like a few years after the attempted coups in the early 2000s, like they had one of these things. Liberia, Angola, Mozambique had these things while they were demobilizing and trying to reintegrate folks. So I think looking at mutinies could be pretty helpful. You know, quantitatively might be a bit of a challenge, but I think theoretically it could be potentially useful because it can still be seen as a way in which folks can demonstrate, you know, their unhappiness with the status quo without completely breaking the peace. So that's, anyway, I'll leave that there.
Erica.
Thanks. That's an excellent suggestion. And I think that that might help, coming back to something Peter said about distinguishing between the coups that are happening from the bottom and from the top, right? That like a lot of what the ways in which junior, lower ranked officers and enlisted men can express dissatisfaction is not by actually trying to seize power themselves, but by having these more lower level sort of mutinies. And so, you know, I think that's an excellent suggestion, and I will take it. Thank you.
Peter.
Yeah, to build off Jonathan's idea about looking at discontent short of an overt coup attempt, on the sort of incumbent military side, you might look at sort of foot dragging in the implementing the integration process. Again, hard to do large N, but if you explore more case studies, might be useful. You might look at Nepal specifically, because there the royal military has sort of done a terrific job of foot dragging on the integration process, where they invite the Maoist rebels to come to these cantonments, sort of way stations, and to be integrated. And, you know, they feed them, but they don't do much else. And they just wait and wait and wait. And then many of the individual soldiers just desert. And then they say, well, nobody wants to be integrated in the military. They just walked off in the middle of the night, and they make it really easy for them to desert. And that's sort of resistance to the integration process on the part of the incumbent military, short of a coup. And that might be something to just look at too, that sort of, you know, broadens the outcomes that you look at, not just an overt attempt to overthrow the government.
Erica. No.
Sorry. I was just say, great suggestion. Thank you. Thanks so much, Peter. And that the Nepal case is super fascinating. So yeah, I think that'd be a good case to look at next. And in general, I appreciate the suggestion now coming from multiple people here to both not just be broadening sort of one of the independent variables I'm thinking about, but also the dependent variable here. And that there's no reason necessarily that the grievances that either the rebels would have or the existing military would necessarily mean that they think regime change has to be the sort of but they could be registering their disagreement in these other sort of ways. So this is really opening up, I think, some new avenues for me, and I really appreciate it.
Awesome. So we're about out of time, and I would like to thank everybody so much for participating today. Thank you, Erica, for sharing your work with us. Thank you, Jonathan, June, and Peter for reading the work carefully and giving great comments to help her move the paper forward and the project forward. And thank you so much. I would like to invite everybody back to tune in on May 17th at the same bat time, same bat channel. And Howard Liu will be presenting our final paper of the season. And he's presenting his Bremer Award-winning paper on repression and dissent. So thank you, everyone, again, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.